right, y'all. Well, as I said, we're going to be looking at the life of Elijah again today. This is the last week in our series on Elijah, and I could not be more excited to be bringing you the word today. And I want to start with a question. Have you ever had a time in your life where you experienced victory, but it didn't feel like you expected? I'll go a level deeper. You ever had a time in your life where God called you to something, you showed up, you fulfilled the calling, but it still felt like something was missing afterwards? Like things didn't turn out the way they were supposed to for you, even if they did for other people. Well, here in the last week of this series, we're going to see Elijah go through a journey of chewing on exactly that. But it's important to acknowledge how we got here before we talk about that. So I want to catch you up on the highlights. I'm not going to go deep, so my Old Testament scholars who are expecting me to hit every little beat here, I'm so sorry, that would be a sermon of its own. But I just want to take a couple of minutes here at the front to remind us about the time and the age of Elijah. So in this age, I want to remind you guys, Israel is going through a series of kings. And some of these kings are good, but for the most part, they fall on what I would call a corruptometer. They are somewhere between pleasantly corrupt and disturbingly corrupt. It's not a great situation for Israel. There are very few exceptions to this. And of these bad kings, we learn about the fact that there is one named King Ahab who is ruling during the time of Elijah. And King Ahab, he falls somewhere, let's see, no, that's not right, no, nope, not there, nope. I'm going to say he falls a little bit more on the, yeah, that feels right, yeah, disturbingly corrupt. King Ahab is terrible. He sells out the people of Israel. He sells out Yahweh, the one true God, God of the universe, for political alliances. He marries a woman named Jezebel, who brings in with her worship of these false gods, Baal and Asherah, and he sells out what Israel's all about. He rebuilds Jericho, which was a big no-no, as we heard. Not supposed to do that. And then on top of that, he erects idols, physical idols, to these false gods. And God is displeased and says, I am going to bring a drought on Israel. And Elijah is the one who sends the message and lets him know. And then Elijah goes off into the wilderness for a few years and then returns a few years into this drought, 3 years into the drought, and levies a challenge against King Ahab. He says, you bring all of your prophets, hundreds of them, set up an offering, build an idol, meet me on Mount Carmel, and I'll bring my God and my offering, and we'll see whose God is real. We'll see which offering is taken up in fire. And it plays out like this. You have 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah who spend hours upon hours praying for their offering to be taken up. And what do they get for it? Nothing. Nada. Zilch. Zero. They have nothing to show for it. Because as much as we like to pretty it up and call them false gods, they're pretend. They don't exist. Elijah, on the other hand, takes a different approach. And I love this, because I'm a bit of an overconfident person. He starts later building his altar. He doesn't even start at the same time. They've been praying for hours, and he's like, okay, I'll start building. Then he takes the offering, he douses it in water. Remember, the win condition here is the offering gets burnt up by fire. And Elijah's so confident, he drenches it. The whole altar, let alone the offering. What does Elijah get for it? Fire. And not just a little fire. This fire burns up the offering, the wood, the stone, and drinks up every drop of water. Our God is real. Our God is powerful, and he is present. And the people of Israel, who have been in rebellion, respond to this. And Elijah says, take up arms. Let's be rid of the prophets of Baal. And those prophets are slaughtered there on the spot. And then just to top it off, the rains return to Israel. This should be a moment of victory for Elijah. Or should it? See, the idea of victory is a complicated one, even though it doesn't seem like it should be. After all, we see the scorecard. All the prophets are gone. The rain is returned. God has proven himself to his people, even though he shouldn't have to. And yet we're about to see Elijah respond in a way that is uncharacteristic of someone who is experiencing God's victory on this level. So I want you guys to join me in 1 Kings 19. Open up your Bible, open up your app, or I'm going to have it on the screen. I'm going to be taking a second to open up my word here. And we're going to read, just as a start, through verses 1 through 4. So Ahab returns to Jezebel and tells her all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, so may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them, one of her prophets, by this time tomorrow. Then he, Elijah, was afraid, and he arose and ran for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree. And he asked that he might die, saying, it is enough. Now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers. So what's going on here? Elijah just rounded out years upon years of faithfully following God, the one true God, and he saw it play out at a level of magnitude that few in history have experienced or will experience. Yet one threat later, he runs for his life. And to me, it begs the question, why run? Was it fear? Maybe. He'd had a threat levied against him. Was it trauma? This is a man who'd been living on the fringes of society, surviving a drought, being fed by ravens. Was it depression? He had just witnessed a tremendous amount of death, even if it was death for victory's sake. You wouldn't blame him. Is it delusion? After all, this is a queen who's now only grasping onto power. Maybe his response is disproportionate to the threat. Well, whatever we want to speculate, I want to make a different argument. I think it points to the fact that there is a difference between experiencing God's power and his presence. There's a difference between those very concepts. Now, hear me say, this isn't a knock on how God showed up in this circumstance, showing up in a wave of power. This is a commentary on Elijah, and a good reminder, as Ryan taught us the first week, that Elijah is just a man. He's not the person we're supposed to be following. He's pointing to the perfect God. Elijah, even affirmed in James 5 in verse 17, which says, Elijah was a man with a nature like ours. What we see is that Elijah had just experienced God's power demonstrated to the people of Israel. As a prophet, Elijah was experiencing God's power and success. As a prophet, he was taken care of. As a man, however, he was lacking. When fear, trauma, depression, whatever it is, you name it, when those things came upon him, he was distraught. He was disconnected from God. He was at his most human. And what he needed most as a human being, as a soul, was to experience God's presence. But rather than avail himself of that, he ran. He caved to his fear. And I understand Elijah in this. I'm sure we all do. You know, when Joy and I first got married, I had a very small microcosm of an Elijah moment. Not the magnitude. There was no fire and altar. But what I experienced when I met Joy was God's power. I never expected a woman like that to come into my life, to love me the way that she did, to take my daughter as her own. It was proof of God's power to me. And yet, when the first month of marriage brought new financial challenges, parenting adjustments, I was stressed. I was afraid. I was angry. I was depressed. I felt like God had abandoned us. Where is that power that brought us together to keep us together? And we see this dynamic play out in our relationships with our fellow man. We don't say it, but we know there's a difference between power and presence. There's a difference when someone in a position of power creates a rule or a law that positively affects your life. That's great. But it's a lot different when that person in power comes and walks beside you to live it out. I'm not saying one is better than the other, but they're different. So my argument is that Elijah is suffering from a lack of experiencing God's presence, and because of this, Elijah experiences a disproportionate amount of fear and depression. But God's going to meet him. And I want us to look at that, and we're going to continue in verse 5. And he lay down and slept under a broom tree, and behold, an angel touched him and said to him, "Arise and eat." And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. And he ate and drank and lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, "Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you." And he arose and ate and drank and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the Mount of God. So here we are at this second step on Elijah's existential crisis. And I love this part because it's such a strong subversion of our expectations. We just watched Elijah stumble. Some commentaries literally call this Elijah's great failure. Now, you can hear me making the argument that this is simply Elijah at his most human. But one way or another, this is a man who's wrestling with sin and shame in the face of experiencing God's victory. And if you stopped at verse 4, what you might assume you're going to see next is a God who just rained down justice and fire, who's ready to do the same thing to rebellious, out-of-touch Elijah. But instead, God meets Elijah with compassion and care. He doesn't rebuke Elijah. In fact, when Elijah stumbles, God supports. Whatever your perception of Elijah's actions, whether you consider them to be abject failure or a small stumble, God meets him there and supports him, because even though Elijah is done with Elijah, God is not done with Elijah. It's a great reminder for us. How often do we fall short? No show of hands. I know it. We all know it. How often do we fall short just after experiencing God's victory? How often do we lose touch with what God has made us for and forget how God sees us? I could just as easily, and maybe I did, make the slide say, "We stumble, God supports." That's the message here. God is not done with Elijah when he messes up. God is not done with us when we mess up. God is not done with anyone when they mess up. The mess-ups of mankind are not a stumbling block for God. There's no such thing as a stumbling block for God. So our failure and our falling short is not a stumbling block that God has to get over to continue moving love towards us. Now, we have a choice to accept that love, right? Many of us have been the person or know the people whose God's love is trying to penetrate them right now, and they're ignoring it, kind of like Elijah did. But y'all, it's always available. It's always available. So whether you consider it a stumble or failure, we can see that God takes care of him. And yet, God in his perfect love is not done with simply taking care of his wounded prophet. He does not leave him in the wilderness to eat cake and drink water and move on to the next prophet. No. Here in the next verse, we're going to see exactly what God does with Elijah. Join me in verse 9. There he came to a cave and lodged in it, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him and said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He said, "I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with a sword, and I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away. And he said, Go out and stand on the mount before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of a low whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, What are you doing here, Elijah? And he said, I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with a sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away. Here we again see the distinction between God's power and God's presence. Elijah has come to God's mountain. This is the very place where the 10 Commandments were handed down to Moses. He came here still experiencing fear, depression, hopelessness. He's not an active participant in what God's up to. Just because he made the journey, he got told and he got fed to make the journey. He is not the active participant. But God's not done with him. At this point, it's less a matter of what God's going to do, and it's more a matter of whether or not Elijah is going to allow himself to be restored. And we see this tension play out when Yahweh himself asks him this simple question, What are you doing here? It's a question of motives and intention. What are you doing here? Why is this happening? Why have you lost the plot? And Elijah's response is very much in line with his current state. He's in disarray. He paints a picture to God that completely ignores every positive thing that's just happened. In fact, he doesn't even really answer God's question. He doesn't say, well, God, here's what I'm here for. He just says, this is what's going on. And he doesn't even say, deal with it. He just gives the report. He has no hope. And his posture has not changed. Even though he's made the journey, even though he's had 40 days and 40 nights and being taken care of in the wilderness, it has not changed. God's response to this is to call Elijah out of the cave and put on yet another stunning display of his power. A storm that tears up the mountain. Can you imagine? An earthquake. A fire. And yet Scripture is very specific to tell us God is not in those things. No. God passes by, and then the storm, and then the earthquake, and then the fire. But God was not in them. There's a difference between God's power and God's presence. And Elijah knows this. Because when that small voice comes, Elijah's posture changes. We see, and some translations call it this beautiful word of the still small voice. But when the still small voice comes, this small whisper, Elijah knows it's God's presence. He stops being an active participant. The language it uses, the image it conjures up for us, is that he pulls on his cloak and covers his face. It's the image of someone who's prepared for what's ahead and also someone who knows they are in the very presence of God and they need to shield their face. Elijah knows he is in the presence of God. And we don't get a great example of how it changes things actively because it plays out very similar to their last interaction. God says, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" as he approaches to the edge of the cave, cloak on, face covered. And Elijah says the same thing that he said in verse 10, this speech about all that's gone wrong. But what we can infer from that is what changed is inside of Elijah. What changed was the posture of Elijah's heart in response to the presence of God. And from that change of heart came a renewing of his mind and of his body. And it brings up a startling reality. Y'all, we can't get in the way of God's power, but we sure as heck can get in the way of his presence in our lives. Elijah was in his own way. And it's not that he wasn't experiencing God's presence because it wasn't available. It's because Elijah and his circumstances were in the way. Elijah was in a bad way, and let's give him grace for that. He saw things and did things that some of us will never see a magnitude like that. Forgetting God's power, just the amount of bloodshed and suffering that he saw. He's seen it in levels of magnitude we won't ever experience. So let's have grace for him. But all the same, his self-perception and his understanding of his circumstances stopped him from seeking out God's presence when the threat came. We've all done this. We've all been in circumstances where it's easier to live in the circumstance than it is to opt into God's presence, which sometimes we have to sit and wait. We have to take the time to be still, to be silent. And sometimes there are circumstances that call for that. But I'd challenge all of us to be honest about how many times do we create circumstances or put ourselves in positions where we opt into anything but God's presence. So speaking of posture change, I want us to take a bit of a posture change. I am very well aware of the dynamic that plays out between me up here teaching the lesson and you who I'm so blessed to get to teach it to. But I want to ask some tough questions, and what I want to ask for as we step into these questions, because these are the questions I want to leave us with as we enter the Advent season, is I just want to ask you inside, on a heart level, to adjust your posture to one of being willing to look inward. I don't want to teach in the next few minutes. I just want to ask some questions that are meant to stir up something. And you may find nothing there. You may find out you are doing great in these things. But I wonder if with some of these questions, it might lead you to ponder if God's asking you to make a change, to grow, to stretch. These questions all come out of what we've learned. My first question for you is, what roles do power and presence play in your life? As we've recognized, these can be partners to each other, but they are different things. We see the difference in God's power and presence, and it forces us to recognize that our relationship with each concept is different. So I want to ask you, what do you feel more drawn to? Is it power? Is it presence? When you are in a place where others need you, where do you go first? As a leader in your community, as a leader in your workplace, do you tend to lead out of power or out of presence? Would you rather make rules or walk alongside the people affected by the rules? For my parents in the room, is it power or is it presence? Would you rather make rules, which is totally within our rights as parents, don't hear me say otherwise, but would you rather make rules and force kids to follow them? There's a time and a place for that. Or do you want to parent with presence, sitting with them in the hard moments? There's a time and a place for both. My question is, what do you naturally lean to? What's your bent? Our people need both. Our kids need both. The people we serve need both. Let's consider our biases and ask the tough question about if God is asking us to stretch or lean in a new direction. My second question for you is, do you believe God will take care of you and utilize you even if you fall short? This is a closed-ended yes or no question with a very obvious right answer. I'm not asking you for the theologically correct answer. I'm asking you how deeply you believe this. We all know the correct answer is yeah. But how deeply do you believe it? Do you believe that if you stumble, fall short, fail, lose yourself, crumble under the pressure, lose the plot to fear, that God will give up on you? Or do you believe that God will not only take care of you, every part of your soul, body, mind, and heart, but that He will continue to see you the way He does, even if you don't? Do you believe that God will stick to His calling for your life, even if you don't? And if you struggle with that, where do you struggle to believe it? In the body? In the mind? In the heart? Where are those places where you struggle to believe that God will never stop wanting your best and will never stop taking care of you? And finally, my last question. What is standing in the way of you experiencing God's presence? For Elijah, we can safely say that it was fear, hopelessness, circumstances. We could also infer that it was maybe the double-edged sword of his calling. He had experienced so much of God's power that you could forgive him for missing the fact that he wasn't communing with God when he needed to the most. What is it for us, though? Is it the allure of God's power? The idea that sometimes what we really want is for God to win over our enemies, champion our political causes, stomp out the social causes we don't agree with. Are we allured by that to the point where it distracts us from God's presence? If it's not his power we're distracted by, maybe it's our own. What are the things we create for ourselves to get control and power over hard circumstances? I'm guilty of this. I'll tell you a quick story. 4 months into COVID, I put myself into a bad situation, got into a bad dating relationship, let it eat me alive, and I did that in the midst of social isolation, working from home. I was still learning to be a single parent, and it hurt. It hurt going through something so small and simple as a breakup because of all those mitigating factors. And I wanted to do anything to make that pain go away. And I would talk to some of my closest friends, and I would say, what do I do? Maybe I need to go do this. Maybe I need to go do that. Thank God for my friend Dana. My friend Dana has been like a sister to me for over half of my adult life. She's an exemplary example of why platonic male-female friendship is so important, because she brought in a perspective no one else had, and it was from the fact that she knew about God's presence. She said, Corey, you might just need to sit in it. You might just need to wait out God's presence. Because my mind was flooded with all sorts of things that I could have done to take control. And it took one person saying a hard truth that I might need to sit in it. And I sat in it for 2 more weeks. And during that 2 weeks, my mind continued to be flooded with all these ways that I could take control. And it wasn't until 2 weeks later that all of that silenced. And I finally heard God, and I was finally able to step into his presence. I got out of my own way, and I heard from God, and it changed the trajectory of my life forever. It sounds so simple, but I would not have been ready to be at this church. I would not have been ready to marry my love. I would not have been ready to co-parent. I would not have been ready for anything God had next for me if I had continued to step in and try and control and exercise my power. We can't get distracted by power when what we're looking for is presence. I'm not condemning power, but power is a very alluring distraction to presence. So what is it for you? Is there a hobby you're letting get in the way because it's easier than dealing with some hard thoughts? Is there a relationship you're stepping into as a way of not dealing with grief? Is it the desire for God's power to reign? I want us to sit in this for a few minutes. The staff and I, when we sat down this week and I talked about the direction I was going, agreed that the best way we could wrap up this series was to spend a moment in reflection. So Ryan's going to come up here and he's going to lead us in another iteration of No Longer Slaves, because I couldn't think of a better song. Because what we see Elijah going through is slavery to fear. He's struggling. And what I love about this song is that it depicts the journey of giving that up and opting into both God's power and his presence. So I'm going to put the questions up on screen, unless the clicker's dead, in which case I'm going to need somebody to advance the slides. There it is. Hey, cool. I'm going to put the questions on screen, and I'm going to leave them there. And Ryan's going to lead us through No Longer Slaves one more time. And I just want you to take this opportunity. I'm not asking you to stand up and worship. I want all of us to go into the quietness of ourselves and ponder these questions. I think this is what God has for us as we enter the Advent season and as we end off our series on Elijah. So join me in quietly contemplating these questions, and I'll come back up in a minute after Ryan finishes the song.
we've been liberated from our bondage. We're the sons and the daughters. Let us sing our freedom. Oh, 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 oh. You split the sea so I could walk right through it. My fears were drowned in perfect love. You rescued me so I could stand and sing. I am a child of God. You split the sea so I could walk right through it. My fears were drowned in perfect love. You rescued me so I could stand and sing. I am a child of God. I am a child of God. I am a child of God. See, I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. No, I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. I am a child of God. I am a child of God.
I want to take a minute to just remind you where Elijah goes from here. It is the end of the sermon series after all, but it's also a great reminder of what we stand to gain when we step into God's presence and allow Him to renew us and repurpose us. Verse 15. And the Lord said to him, "Go return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael to be king over Syria, and Jehu the son of Nimshi you shall anoint to be king over Israel, and Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel Manolah you shall anoint to be prophet in your place. And the one who escapes from the sword of Hazael shall Jehu put to death, and the one who escapes from the sword of Jehu shall Elisha put to death. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." With the strength of his power, God claimed victory with Elijah as his prophet and witness. With his presence, God met Elijah's fears and sorrows, confirming that Israel was not hopeless, Elijah was not alone, and that his ministry would continue with him as a very active participant. And we're fortunate to know that Elijah's ministry stretches far beyond what God details here, to the point of being taken up into the cloud and eventually appearing at the transfiguration of Christ. It's not too late. It's never too late to step into the presence of God. It's never too late to leave our biases for power behind. And that presence changes everything. I hope you are equal parts challenged and encouraged by that. And remember that we have something Elijah didn't. We have the benefit of living on the other side of the cross. We have the perfect example and sacrifice of Christ and the perfect ministry to our souls of the Holy Spirit. Remember that God is present, and join me in considering what it will look like in this season to engage with him in that way. God's power changes everything. God's presence changes us, and God's care bridges the gap. Join me in prayer. Father, thank you for the fact that you do care for us. This part of Elijah's story is such a great reminder that your care for us isn't exclusive to prophets. It's for each and every person in this room, and it's available to every person on this earth. Thank you for that love, Father. Thank you for never losing sight of who we can be, even when we do. Thank you for the fact that your power is present in this world, and that your presence is always available. We don't deserve it outside of the loving sacrifice of Christ, who blessed us with access to your constant presence. Thank you for that gift, Father. As we enter the Advent season and leave behind our series on Elijah, help us to carry these challenges and these encouragements and these lessons with us, because we know they apply. We know they apply to what we will see during the holiday season and beyond. Help us to be challenged, to lean out of our biases, and to grow. Grow into people who are a reflection of both your power and your presence and your care. Help us to reflect that to a world that needs all three, Father. I lift myself and this congregation who I love so much, and our community and the season ahead up to you. In the name of your Son and by the power of your Holy Spirit. Amen.